So, I was just going through this book, the from Rabbi Bechorn, and basically argues back against Eila Divrei Bris. Right now, he's got about 8 or 10 pages on why you can pray in German. Proofs from all over, and then he argues against the Chassam Sofer, who puts forward a few arguments. Number one, that there's sort of the argument from what we would think of as Kabbalah, but really Sefer Hasidim at that time, which is that there's a certain amount of words, and Ezra and his Bezdin made it exactly what it's supposed to be, and you can't change it at all. And he basically argues, you see Gemaras where they argue over how a bracha is supposed to be composed. For instance, Borei Morei Oesh Smachot Beishaman, they still how to phrase it, and other ones. And he says if Ezra and his Bezdin had really fixed exactly how every bracha is supposed to be, you wouldn't have machloks and later in the Gemara. So he says, he concludes, Omnam ha'emes edus la'atzma she'ezra u'bezdin lo tiknu l'chokbo. He says it's obvious that Ezra and his Bezdin did not create exactly the language of every bracha that we have to have every tefillah. But rather, Ezra created themes for, and that's really we're talking about the Amidah, and within that theme, you're allowed to be creative. I mean, actually, there's more obvious proofs, I think, in the Gemara for this, which is, for the most obvious one I can think of is that in the Gemara itself, says, if a chazan gets up there and he says, Ad kan sipor yagir rachamecha, your mercy reaches even to a bird's nest, or Shema Shema, that you take him down. So the question, why is he doing that? And the Gemara doesn't say because he didn't do it exactly the way it's supposed to be done. The Gemara says because you worry that Shema Shema means there's two rishuyot, there's two gods, or Ad kan sipor yagir rachamecha, your mercy reaches to a bird's nest. The Gemara says because either God's mitzvot are not about mercy, or the other opinion is that you're going to make other animals feel bad by pointing out that God has a special mitzvah to shoo away the mother bird. So you see the Gemara's answer there is not every bracha has to be exactly the way Ezra made it. So, I think it's a pretty good argument that he makes back against the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer had said, exactly the way it's been said is how you have to do it. He's saying basically that that's not really true. That Anshe Knesset Gadol or Ezra made the tefillah, made the Amidah in themes, and you have to stick to those themes. But the words don't have to be exactly the way they are. I mean, there is a matdeya bracha. You have to say Baruch Atah Hashem, but now that's not necessarily an argument for leaving out whole brachas. Like, in other words, on the other hand, what do the Reform want to do, right? They don't want to change atachonim la'adam dat, you give the human being wisdom. What they want to change is the brachas of geula, the brachas of redemption, or the brachas of God should bring us back to Israel. So if you change that, if you leave that out, or if you leave out part of that blessing, aren't you actually changing the whole theme? Aren't you really changing? I mean, that seems, if that's what the Reform want to do, and that's certainly part of the Chassam Sofer's criticism, that seems like a much bigger problem than just the
right,
change.
to remove something which has been done is much more of a statement than
I mean, that does go against
new or not including something new, or modifying slightly something which exists.
Right, it does, changing the language, or doing it in a different language. Spends a lot of time here arguing also for being able to pray in the vernacular, but I mean, leaving out, even if you argue that what Ezra established was 18 themes for the blessings, leaving one out or changing the theme of Geula to something else, that's now whether he has not argued for that. I mean, we don't see that. I don't think we've seen at all any of these quote Orthodox rabbis arguing. They've argued for a lot of things, the instruments, German, but getting rid of the silent Amidah, but I don't think any of them have argued for. In other words, it's been a criticism of the Chassam Sofer and others of the reformer getting rid of references to the redemption. But I don't think we've seen any of the Orthodox rabbis who've defended the reform defend that you could get rid of references to the redemption. I think that would be a much more radical, maybe that's the most radical move, actually. And he says the rabbi, the editor of the Mishnah said that you can't change the frame of the blessing, the matbeya, but he's trying to argue that you could change the language. That's what a lot of this is about, sort of re-arguing that same case that you could pray in another language and you could change the blessing slightly. And he goes back to the Rambam. The Rambam, Chassam Sofer quoted the Rambam, that the Rambam said that people didn't know how to pray in their own language. And so the rabbis created prayer in Hebrew specifically because people were not able to compose well their prayers. So he uses that as a proof the other way. He says, you see that they only did that because people couldn't compose their own prayers. But if they had had the ability to compose their own prayers in their own language, V'safa eretz moladatam, v'safa berura, b'li shibush v'yirvuv, if they could have done it well, that you see from that Rambam, it was the opposite, that Ezra and his Bezdin would not have said you have to do it in Hebrew. And he says, now we can do it in German very well. It'd be better to pray in the language that we understand. I mean, so he's projecting back all the way back and saying, because the Rambam gives the reason, which is that they weren't able to pray well in their own language, we should be able to do that. And obviously that's who's been praying in Hebrew for 2,000 years. So, in a way, they're kind of talking on different levels and not really speaking to each other, and so forth. And then he says that he calls it, and then he reiterates that he had only said it about Pesukei Zimra, that he didn't mean to change the Shema and Amidah. And then he addresses this issue of lotit godu, that the criticism that you're not allowed to have different customs in the same city. And isn't the reform changing all these things, creating a different custom in the same city? It's going to look like the Jews are different groups and that they don't agree with each other. So he says it's really not lotus godu, and what he tries to say is that lotus godu, not making Jews into different groups, only applies to mitzvahs from the Torah. It does not apply to rabbinic things. Whereas with regard to rabbinic things, you could have different versions of prayer, one nosach, another nosach in the same city, and that's fine. The davar hatali b'minhag, if it's something that is dependent on custom, you definitely see from the Gemara, he says that would be okay. That's not called losis. That's the argument for that. And then he moves into instruments. It's interesting that he doesn't mention. Interesting that nobody seems to defend. I'm going to look closer to see if anybody tries to defend getting rid of the language of redemption, because that would seem like a real hard line. So he says, singing with instruments. He argues basically that you're allowed to ask a non-Jew to do things for a mitzvah on Shabbos, that if the lights go out in the shul, you could ask a non-Jew to relight the candles. And so he says that's the same idea here as asking a non-Jew to play instruments, which actually playing instruments is probably forbidden only rabbinically. And he says, the argument that the Chassam Sofer had argued that that's only if it's temporary, but not permanent. You can't make a permanent violation of something that you're asking a non-Jew to do in the synagogue. About Tam Hanal, And so he tries to prove that that's not true. And then he addresses of chukoteim. What about walking in their ways? And he does it in a very similar way to what we've seen before, that only applies to darkei ha'emori, that walking in their ways only applies to something they specifically do for some kind of sorcery practice. He calls the Chassam Sofer the Sofer. Biyom she'edaber. What are we going to say to the Chassam Sofer? Asherah b'chalomo shemishum kach lo haya machnisim ugo l'beis hamikdash. It sounds like the Chassam Sofer may at some point have said that he saw in a dream that you shouldn't bring an instrument into the shul because it's not fitting. So he says, like, what am I going to answer to that? Shir of Imota Shia Ugav Chokshel of the Akum. So he says this argument that the Ugav, the organ, is a Chok Akum, that's a non-Jewish, way of doing things. Therefore, not allowed to do it. So he says, it's mentioned in Tehillim, Kinor v'Ugav. That's not really true, that in ancient times Jews did play these instruments, and we've seen some of these arguments before. And then he so then he talks a little bit about why he's doing this here. Sham Yisrael Hito as Nechem Shimu. He says, Mahu, it's all about the Jewish people, about guiding the Jewish people, that the Jewish people are like sheep. And how do you shepherd? That this medrash that God chooses Moshe as the shepherd because Moshe chases after a certain sheep that was thirsty. So God says, I want the shepherd of the Jewish people to be one that recognizes the needs of each individual sheep, of each individual Jew. And that's why God makes Moshe the leader, because he had been a shepherd. So he says, Yaf Moshe Banu HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ela Bitzon. This is the story of the sheep running away. So he says, because you're so merciful to the sheep, you'll have mercy on my people, you can be their shepherd. So why am I bringing this medrash? She says, that we understand who we're supposed to be as leaders. That this medrash teaches us that when we shepherd the Jewish people, we have to do it according to each person's strengths and needs. And the small sheep that run away from the flock, you have to bring them back on your shoulder. That they shouldn't totally leave the flock. And you have to bring them to water, give them water to drink. So he says it's the same with the Jewish people today. Jewish people are so distant. And just like sheep, you have to give them food and water. And that's the job of the shepherd. So too, we have to give the Jewish people what they need spiritually. The Chazal write that every person who guides the Jewish people with mercy and correctly, they will merit the world to come. In a Yafa Asu, what he does here. Omar Beit Rishoyim Yashmid Tishvar Nezrot Rishayim. He has a pasuk here and he puts circles over certain letters. Beis, Yud, Taf, which is Bayit. So Bayit could be a reference to the Hamburg temple. He says it's good what Hamburg Bezdin wrote. It's not going to help. My Yiddish not good enough. Let's see. Hine pulas mochekam hishavti hema kino et sefer Ornoga b'torah avon. They called Ornoga by its letters Aleph Vav Nun, which is avon, v'hayetaza, which means sin. Reshit onam v'avam amal v'aven anikrati l'sefer. So he says, I'm going to play the same game with Sefer Divrei Habris. What am I going to call it? Diba, Dalid, Beis, Hey, which spells out Lashon Hara. Diba means like slander. Himotzia Dibas Arshra, because that's, they're spreading slander about us. So he's like, we can both play the same acronym game. And Rabbi Yochanan says in the Gemara that on the day the temple was destroyed, prophecy was lost, and it was given to fools. Kimotze diba amru sha'anochi osek behigayon v'shem higayon morea al ishtadlut harayon b'machshava b'bechina atzuma chakira nefla amarti. Apparently, the stories in the Gemara where certain people who are insane would say certain things, rabbis would learn things from them. Here, just talking against them. Saying the wise of Israel need to look closely at what they're doing, what they're saying. And here he addresses some stuff more directly. Page 53. Says, so he quotes the Chassam Sofer, who's speaking about him, Rabbi Aaron Charner, so he says, the Chassam Sofer's criticism of me and the letter that he quotes from me is wrong. It's wrong. I didn't write anything in my letter that you should have left out. Now, the Chassam Sofer says that I took everything back. Dine Kilagisha Hamburg, Diana Kilagisha Hamburg, Barash Asu, Shavar, Kasvi make Fochel Aaron Haran, Fisano, yes, is us. And they write in their book, the Hamburg Bezdin writes that we didn't republish the letter against Rabbi Aaron Haran because of the honor due to him. Load Fisay Gersh because he plays the same game, because Ba'avur. So he basically says, the Chassam Sofer, when he quotes me, and he says the wrong thing. Toad Sofer. Toad Sofer is a pun. Toad Sofer means a scribal mistake. So here he's saying Toad Sofer means a mistake of the Chassam Sofer. He says, I explained in what I wrote, all the details of why I was right. But some Sofer wrote that I had recanted everything. So that's fine original. That seems strange.
Now, there's sort of this jousting back and forth between the two of them in writing.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any record of any direct animosity or tension? Yeah.
I don't know if they ever
non-written away between them.
It's a great question because they did both live in Hungary. Now, how far Erd is from Pressburg is a good question. Sometimes these things also get like blown out of proportion, meaning one person starts to talk about, Rabbi so-and-so as a heretic, and it just gets, played out. I mean, he clearly is a big Talmid Chacham, the way that he writes. But the rabbis who are writing against these folks are worried, and they are taking a hard line. It's two very different worldviews. That's what I think. This idea that Judaism is not a set in stone as you think, and by letting people tailor it to their needs, that's going to be a positive thing. I mean, that's his position. The Chassam Sofer's position is, this is all leading us toward a black hole of enlightenment that is going to destroy everything. Now, they're both good arguments. You can see where they're both coming from. It'd be nice to find his original letter and see what's really in it. See if some Sofer quotes him correctly or not. See if he really did recant or not. I mean, it sure doesn't seem like from this, which is written afterwards, written 6 months later, sure doesn't seem like he recanted at all. So would the Chassam Sofer make that up? Or is it like communication? That's what you find today. I mean, right? In other words, one rabbi says something one day to somebody, doesn't mean he really believes that or does that or doesn't change his mind or, it's a slower process back then because they just had letters, but right. Were they ever in touch? They would meet each other, discuss. I don't know. I'll check into that. I'd be interested to see if there's any communication between Pressburg and Erd. I'm not even sure where they both are. Okay. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you.